I have a feeling I'm Shane Whalley, uh, the keeper of the conversation. And I really want to have this be a conversation and uh, not just me, because I have the feeling I know some of you. There's a lot of wisdom with the participants, and so um, uh, oh, great. So thank you. People are introducing themselves in the chat. So since we're recording this part, that might be helpful. I'd really love to know your name, where you're from, especially if you're a school-based person, what school, and then pronouns. And then did you come with a question or something you were hoping we were going to talk about? And that will let me know if my PowerPoint slides are on point, or if I'm just going to throw up a blank slide and talk about what you want to talk about. I agreed to have about the first 30 minutes be recorded, and then to take it off because I really do want to have a conversation. I have strong feelings about what should be happening in our schools. National documents back up what I think should be happening in our schools, but I want to know what's really happening in the schools and what is going well, what you tried to do, what you've been successful for, and then what I'm really hoping we'll spend the last part of our time together doing is like, what barriers are you kind of pushing up against? Because again, collective in the wisdom in the room, in the Zoom room, I'm hoping that we can try to knock down or share tactics and strategies to do that. I'm also aware that I'm doing this workshop in the context of a lot of things happening, right? It's Pride Month. It also is a time where we're talking about race in a different way than we have talked about it in my lifetime, and I'm old. So we've been talking about it in my lifetime for a really long time. But you know, I think there's a truth telling and a heaviness, and so I want to make sure that you know, I'm also coming to this conversation you know, with an intersectional lens, and with that I'm going to share my PowerPoint because that is kind of the first thing I want to oh, that is not what I want to do. Oof. I almost left the meeting. That would have been embarrassing. Wrong button. All right, here we go. Blah, 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 very long title. Just so you know, my pronouns are Z, here, and here's. In the current hat that I wear, one of the current hats, I'm a social worker, and I currently am the Community Equity and Inclusion Coordinator for Austin Independent School District. And I got permission, which I'm really happy about, to do this presentation with my official hat on. And I would say that AISD is not quite yet doing all the things that I'm going to say we should be doing. So I'm also going to own that part of it. And we've got a group of people who's kind of doing this work and talking about it and trying to make changes. So, so I think it's always important whenever I'm facilitating a conversation to be upfront about who I am and what my identities are and how I come to this work. So this is color coded, and there's a lie, and I will come clean about the lie. So the blue places are places that I have privilege, right? They're places that don't jam me up. They're places that I navigate the world with a lot of ease in ways that I don't even have to think about. I never have to say that I'm English, Danish, American, right? Even though we know that American is code for white. Matter of fact, if I ran around saying that I was English, Danish, American, people were wondering if I'm a tasty breakfast treat or what is happening, right? So the things that are in fuchsia are places that do jam me up and that I do have to navigate. You know, one of the beauties of working from home is, you know, no one gives me side eye or questions my right to use my bathroom. That has been a bonus. I grew up in a Christian household, but I don't identify that way anymore. I do identify as a spiritual person. And then the things that are in green are things that I think of as kind of on the bubble. I'm relatively able-bodied. I have some things that flare up every once in a while that make where I don't feel able-bodied. And then the lie is I'm not 56. 56-year-old me knew how to make this. 59-year-old me has had a hard time figuring out how to edit it. And at some point it just needs to be redone. I will say if you're going to start lying about your age, 56 is probably not the place to start. Just some community guidelines, especially when we get into the conversation part of this, right? Like, there are no stupid questions. I really invite all questions. And if you hit one that I'm not comfortable answering or that I don't know the answer to, I'm just going to be honest about that, right? We've got confidentiality within the bounds of recording. So, which is why I'm not going to ask questions on camera until we turn the recording off. That we use I statements as we're having those conversations, especially if we're talking about our experience. I often am asked to speak for my people, and so I sometimes use we, and I'm trying to break that bad habit. I ask that you take survivable risks when we get to that conversation place, that you take care of yourself if you need to go and get liquid to take in, or if you need to leave to let liquid out, please take good care of yourself. And again, that you please use the chat box as you have questions and conversation, especially while we're in this recorded part of this. This came across Instagram a couple of weeks ago now, and I'm adding it into PowerPoint slides that I do, because I think when we talk about mental health, we often don't think about what mental health professionals call minority stress, or how our identities, so for me, my queer and genderqueer identities, impact my life in a way that have historically impacted my mental health when I was younger in pretty profound ways. So I think it's a great visual for something that we often don't talk about. And it's one of the reasons that I do the work I do, is because I think if we can unearth all of this, it will help raise up the mental health of those who are affected by systemic oppression. I put a couple of slides with stats in here. Again, just to kind of set the stage of why it's so important that we make our schools safer spaces, and that we have to do that through policy. We can't just do that by pretending we're going to do the right thing. Many of us do the right thing, but if our schools aren't putting those practices into policy, then everyone isn't cordially compelled to do the right thing. Right, so we know that we have high dropout rates among LGBTQ youth, and I think especially trans and non-binary youth. I know at AISD we now have trans and non-binary youth all the way down in lower elementary school. So this isn't just something that's happening at high school and middle school levels. Part of my history is that I did my internship, my first year master's level internship at Out Youth, and then came back as the clinical director for a year in 2006. And at that time, having youth that were under 13 come in and talk and ask questions about trans and non-binary identity was rare. And I know that that's not the case anymore, that we're having more and more younger folks who are figuring out who they are younger, and are, some folks are having more support from parents and families, and yet we still know we have younger youth who do not and are having to hide who they are. Again, I just want to really think about how this is amplified when we add race and ethnicity onto the conversation, right? So it isn't that our white LGBT folks aren't facing homophobia and heterosexism, but the impacts of race and amplify the negative impacts of all of that, because people are navigating and facing racism and facing heterosexism and cissexism. One of the resources, and I have a slide at the end with a couple of resources, and this is one of them. If you're not familiar with the Transgender Student Equality Resource page, I highly recommend it. They have great infographics. They are youth-led and youth-driven, which is great. So I want to give a shout out, and I use their work a lot in presentations that I do. And then again, this came out, and I just so appreciate it. And for me, it's the work that we all should be doing, right? Queer, and I'm always going to add trans, right? Trans and non-binary. Queer folks don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of us are truly us and which parts we've created to protect us. And what would it mean for youth, right, to not have to, for them to be authentic all the time, right? Like, part of my mental health story is I grew up with a family with a very large and gender rule book, and the breaking of those rules, the punishment was pretty harsh for me growing up. And it really impacted my mental health as I came out and figured out that gender non-binary part of myself. And, you know, for me, it took a lot of professional help in order to work that through. I'm just going to do I'm going to check the chat box because I can see things are coming in. Oh, cool. All right. Just going to take a minute to make sure I'm not missing anything that I should know before I go forward. Okay. I'm just going to do a tiny bit of theory, just so we make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's important, right? I think for cisgender people, right, for people what's on their birth certificate and how they think about their own identity, often don't think about these 4 different pieces of who we are, right? So we all have something that's on our birth certificate. We think of that oftentimes as a gold standard of what a binary looks like, but we know that on a medical level, right, we have over 250 conditions, medical conditions. This is not always Shane's favorite language, but it's the language that I kind of feel like I have to use. Right, mean that somebody could have differences around hormones, chromosomes, or genitalia. Our birth certificates are legal documents. I actually had to find mine because I have to renew my driver's license, and I'm not looking forward to going in and having that conversation. And then I had to find my name change documentation because my birth certificate still has my dead name on it. We then have our gender identity, right? And we're finding that gender identity, I used to say that formed between 4 and 5, and the new information that's coming out is talking more about that happening between 2 and 3. What we know is that 2 and 3-year-olds' developmental work is to learn about gender, right? So I know if I'm in a women's bathroom, which is what I use if I can't find a single stall bathroom, and there's a little girl in that room, she is going to want to know why I'm there and if I'm a boy or a girl. And I never get upset at tiny kids because I know that developmentally that's their work, like they're doing their job. So I always enjoy talking to them if their parent or caregiver will let them. Usually they are yanked out with wet hands out into the public. What I wish would happen is that the adult that's with them would ask me if I'm okay answering questions. And then I just like to ask them what they think, right? And they think I'm a boy. And I ask them why. And they think, I have the feeling in their head, they're like, did you look in a mirror before you left your house? But instead, they're like, they just go down, right? Your hair, you have a bow tie, you know, all the things. And I just say, if it's not a child who's going to be in my life, I just say, what if I'm a different type of girl? And they're like, okay. look at their caregiver, can I have a cookie? Because it often happens in a grocery store. And right, like out we go. But little kids have a really good sense of who they are. They at least know what they want their gender expression to be. They know what clothes they want to wear. They know what toys they want to play with. And, you know, what happens is you know, does that parent or caregiver roll with that and let them do it and provide safe spaces for them and have conversations with playgroups, schools, grandparents, extended family? Or do they say, like, not in my house, you're not going to do that? Or do they do some combination of, like, you can do it at home, but you can't do it out? And again, the more freedom and authenticity and authentic expression that we can allow children, the happier they're going to be, right, growing up. Again, gender expression is how we show ourselves to others. Gender attribution is how we're perceived by others. Right, for me, I'm often, at first glance, people think I get SIR'd, and then when they look at me and take more of me in, they then ma'am me, and I'm like, can you just say good morning and how are you, and not gender me every 5 seconds? And so again, for gender queer, gender non-binary, gender fluid, gender expansive, we've got all of this beautiful language, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. You know, I have to navigate all 4 of these things all the time. And my safety is involved, how I get treated is involved, my mental health at the end of a long day gets involved. So, you know, it's important, and it's important to help people break apart these different elements. Right. And then there's sexual orientation. So we all have what's on our birth certificate: gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. I believe it's Janet Mock who said, gender identity is who I go to bed as, sexual orientation is who I go to bed with. Oversimplified and handy and helpful. So, you know, one of the questions I have, and this should be numbers, there's a typo, which is not unusual in my PowerPoints, is kind of what we're going to talk about, right? So how do we change the number on that early slide of how do we change the numbers of dropout rates? How do we change the numbers around violence and bullying and harassment, right? And so these are, again, some of my suggestions, and I'm going to just kind of run through some things because of the recording piece, and then we're going to have a bigger conversation in just a little bit. If you have questions or comments, please go ahead and put them in the chat now so we can go back to them. Don't try, you know, if you're like me, my memory sucks right now. And so make notes and know that the conversation is coming. Right, so when we talk about trans and non-binary folks, and we talk about transition, which is, again, the language that we have, for lower elementary, right, pre-puberty, that transition is what we think about as social transition. It's about hair and clothes and makeup, and it's really about how do we change our gender expression in order to match who we are. And then, you know, puberty, then we start talking about medical transition. So I may use, you know, we can talk about, that may be language that I will use going forward as we're having these conversations, because the conversation about elementary school, pre-puberty, and transition is a different conversation, right, than if we're thinking about middle school and high school. So I broke this down in kind of things that can happen in the classroom, and then things that I believe should happen at a district level, right? And probably somewhere in between there are things that can happen at a school level. I know for AASD, schools have a lot of freedom. So things that we can say we want in policy, schools sometimes may or may not do. Or we may have schools that are more forward thinking, that have policies that are more progressive than the district does, which is definitely true at AISD, right? So the most important thing for me is honoring students' names and pronouns. And in the classroom, that just means finding out people's names and pronouns, right? So I've made mistakes with 2 people that are on this call, duly noted, and will be changed going forward. That we need to not be dividing students up by gender. I hear this is still happening, right? Boys in one line, girls in the other, Shane standing in the middle, flailing her hands, being like, I don't know where to go. That people have to not out their students, and that we sometimes, I think that sometimes happens inadvertently and sometimes happens explicitly, right? So we need to find out who knows, who needs to know, who the student wants to have know, and really make sure that we are abiding by that. It's my belief that if we have to, you know, as an adult, so say I'm a teacher, and I know that my student identifies as non-binary, but they've asked me not to let people know. If I feel like I have a reason why I must let someone else know, I need to let that student know. So there always should, in my mind, should be informed consent. If we're having to share people's personal information. Again, keeping birth assigned gender and legal name private, and that is FERPA protected. And so people say legally that they have to share, actually legally they're not supposed to share. And then allowing students to participate in activities based on gender identity, right? Again, that we shouldn't be forcing people to do anything based on what's on their birth certificate. We should always be allowing students to participate based on who they know themselves to be. And then you have to do the work to make sure that that is going to go well, right? And that work also shouldn't be put on the student unless they want to do it. I think some students want to advocate for themselves and they might want to do educational work, but that should not be expected of them. I just threw up the pronoun chart. Again, this may be familiar to people, but the Trans Student Educational Resources has this great chart. I'm a big fan of people printing it out and putting it up in places. It helps let people know that pronouns are something that are talked about. It helps people practice their grammar. It's, for me, it's just a great tool. And again, there are people who are using pronouns that are beyond this chart, and that's the other thing that's important. I've had people say like, Z and here, you can't use that, they're old. And I'm like, I can use that. And don't tell me I can't, right? Okay, I'm gonna ask people to share. I'm going to go past this and come back later. I'm going to do it really fast and hopefully you didn't cheat. Okay, I'm going to try to stay on point while we're recording. So district-wide, right, we need people to have easy methods to change names and pronouns within their systems. We need to have gender-inclusive restrooms in all schools, and they need to not be in goofy places, like in the principal's office or even the nurse's office. I was in a high school recently, I was giving a training, and I didn't know the school very well, so I asked somebody, I said, oh, is there a gender-inclusive bathroom? And they said, oh, yeah, it's in the nurse's office, and we made sure the nurse's office was unlocked. And of course, the nurse's office was locked, and so I went and used a gendered bathroom. And then I was talking to somebody about it and they were like, oh, if you always had to go in the nurse's room, it would mean that you were sick, right? And then it's easy to internalize that who I am around my gender is my illness, and that is not a message that we want to be sending. So gender, or they're in the furthest mobile, and so people are always late, right? Because they're having to run back and forth long distances to get to the bathroom. Non-discrimination policies need to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. That way everybody's covered. And I sometimes get asked, like, why does it need to be in policy? And the reason it needs to be in policy is that if it isn't, and I've often heard this, well, of course we would do the right thing. But if you don't do the right thing, I don't have any legal recourse. So it has to be in policy so there's a way for me to be able to legally push back against it. Right, we have to make sure that dress codes honor students' identity, and that, you know, for years and years and years, we've had court cases, especially around senior photos, where women are supposed to wear the drape and men are supposed to wear like tuxes, right? And there have been people who are seen as female identified who've asked to wear the tux, and they have been told no because it's distressing to have that picture in the yearbook. And it's like, it's distressing to have a really unhappy, uncomfortable person pictured in their yearbook because they're in a drape that makes them feel terrible, or they choose not to have their picture in the yearbook because they refuse to have it be taken that way. So, and then we have to have training for everyone in the school. I hear this all the time. People are like, oh, well, our teachers were trained. Well, what happens when I go into the cafeteria? Or I will say that custodial staff are my worst nightmare in bathrooms, because if I'm trying to go in, I will often get stopped by a custodial person who, again, is not bad intention, but bad impact on me. So we have to train everybody. It doesn't mean they have to have the same level of training, but everybody has to have a basic training to understand the frameworks and the concepts, and to understand how to navigate good intentions with hard and negative impacts.